All right, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. We're going to get started. So welcome to the School of Education Doctoral Student Colloquium series presentation. My name is Jamina Williams, and I'm the Director of Student Services, and I'm going to be the moderator this afternoon. We are so pleased to welcome all of our virtual attendees, including School of Education faculty, staff, and students, the university body at large, community members, and partner associations, among others. The Doctoral Student Colloquium series offers School of Education doctoral students an opportunity to share their original research and learn from their peers, faculty, and staff. Each month, we have one EDD and one PhD student to present their research at the colloquium, which is normally offered both on campus at Drexel and online through Zoom. However, due to COVID this year, all of our colloquium events will be online. These sessions help our doctoral students to connect with each other and develop a peer community that is invaluable in supporting their journeys in the program. So also, in addition to presenting, each doctoral student is asked to write a research brief that relates to his or her presentation, which is then included in an edited publication titled Doctoral Student Research Briefs, published on the School of Education's website. The research brief is a way to disseminate our doctoral students' research as shared in the colloquium in a concise format with relevance to education. So today, each presenter will be provided 20 minutes to share their research, and then we'll move on to questions and answers following each presentation. So if you can please save your questions to the end, and you're welcome to type your questions in the chat area of the Zoom or use your mic to ask the questions. So our first speaker today is Kimberly Sterin, who is a PhD student in the School of Education. Kimberly is a second-year PhD student studying education policy and leadership at the School of Education at Drexel University. Before joining Drexel, Kimberly spent 7 years as an English teacher in K-12 public schools in Montgomery County, Maryland. Kimberly was awarded the Johns Hopkins Dr. Diane Tobin Memorial Award for Excellence in Teaching in 2017. Kimberly earned a master's degree in secondary education from Johns Hopkins University, and she also holds a bachelor's degree in English language and literature and Spanish language and literature, as well as a minor in creative writing with a concentration in poetry from the University of Maryland, College Park. Her current research interests focus on education funding policies, resource management, and equity. And she has also recently been published in the Philadelphia Inquirer, so we're really excited for her. Today, Kimberly will be speaking about how can we make it equitable, the critical role of school-level business administrators in managing school resources. So now I'd like to turn it over to Kimberly for her presentation. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Jamina. I really appreciate that introduction, and thank you to everyone for joining me today for my presentation. So how can we make it equitable? The critical role of school-level business administrators in managing school resources. A little roadmap for our presentation today. I'll go over the study's purpose, the background, my positionality, research questions, research design, theoretical framework, our preliminary findings and discussion, and significance and implications. Purpose. The purpose of this phenomenological study is to explore how public high school business administrators, or SBAs, navigate issues of equity when managing resources. I'll be using the term equity and equitable a lot during the presentation, and for the purposes of this study, it is defined as the allocation of resources based on a demonstrated need. In the context of funding, which is one type of resource, mostly in America, we have image number one, our current funding model, where the most advantaged are also having the most amount of resources and funding. Two, if we had equal funding, it would look at like image two. And three, which is kind of our gold standard, what we're aiming for, to allocate our resources more equitably based on need so that everyone can see over the fence to perhaps the lovely Drexel University. So what do SBAs do? Who are they? Not every school has a school business administrator, and even ones that do, they go by many different names. They can be financial specialists, but business officer, even bookkeeper in some instances. But for the purposes of this study, since it is phenomenological and it focuses on a specific school district, we will rely on that school district's definition, which reads, Under direction of the principal, the school business administrator provides overall leadership and manages non-instructional activities in high school related to budget, accounting, finance, and operations management. Historically, the SBAs are valued for their technical skills. So what's interesting about my study is I'm really looking to problematize this traditional view of SBAs as just the money people by framing it within this equity lens and looking at their capacity to influence the equitable practices at their school. Quick background on equity in school finance, right? Why does this matter? Why is it such an issue? Well, many American neighborhoods are segregated, especially by race and economic class, as they are inextricably linked in our public policies. And most public school populations are neighborhood based. So this collection distribution structure produces vastly disparate levels of funding between districts and schools. So our students are starting on unequal footing, which really makes the role of the school business administrator all the more important in managing and allocating resources. And I have the pie chart on the right just to remind us that the majority of most schools' funding do come from the local school district, which are mostly reliant on that property tax base, which produces this disparity. Significance of research. There is an identified gap in the use specifically of qualitative methods to document the perspectives of school-level business administrators, especially regarding management of resources in equitable ways. Most of the literature in education finance is quantitative, so this study really looks to add the qualitative parts, the stories behind the numbers. So how did I come to this research? A little bit about my background and positionality, what made me interested in it. My key identities include that I'm a white Jewish woman from an upper middle class background. And in my educational experience, I actually attended private schools from pre-K through 12th grade. I had the privilege of attending a lot of really high resourced schools. I was a super involved student. I loved extracurriculars, clubs, you name it, I was there, and it really benefited my experience. So then when I became a teacher, I did a similar thing, and I taught, as Jamina mentioned, for 7 years in Title I public schools, and a lot of these schools were under-resourced. So when I became the debate coach, the cross-country team coach, the Lit Mag sponsor, et cetera, there were too many for me to name. I did not list them. I really strive to produce high quality experiences for my kids, which ended up me being a part-time fundraiser in ways and really looking to garner resources for my students. You can see a picture of me with a laughably large check for a whopping $125 at the bottom there in one of my efforts. So through this time, I became really close with the school business administrator as they managed the accounts. And now in my PhD experience, reflecting on my teaching experience, I really wanted to investigate further, what are their roles? How do they influence policy? And of course, I have a picture of the kids because in our work, we want to always remember that it's about them and center the students in my research. So I am disclosing that I have insider bias. I have worked within the same school district as the participants and in the same school as one of the participants. My research questions. How do high school business administrators navigate issues of equity through their role as mediators of school resources? How do the ideologies of school business administrators inform their practices regarding resource management? And thirdly, how can the lived experiences of school business administrators inform policy related to resource management? In this pilot study, I'll be focusing on research question number 1. My design, I used purposive and then snowball sampling. I have 2 SBAs in the pilot study. One is a Black female and one is a white male. They're both from the same large, densely populated suburban public school district, although there's about a 35% difference in the FARMS population of these 2 schools. FARMS stands for free and reduced meals, and it's often used as a proxy for wealth. So I point this out just to say there was a disparity. One school was much more wealthy than the other. And in this district, there is a large spectrum of wealth, which is interesting in the context of the school business administrator, because it really, as we'll see in the findings, influenced their role and what they were able to do with their school communities. This study is fully qualitative. My data collection was based on semi-structured interviews. I did 2 cycles of coding, starting with in vivo to keep the findings close to the participants' words themselves. And then secondly, I applied Grubb's logic of improved school finance, which I'll explain now. So this is my theoretical framework. Warner Norton Grubb II is a well-known economist who specializes in education finance. And he has this theory of the logic of improved school finance. His theory really argues for a more complex view. He believes that we cannot really measure true equity just by looking at inputs and outputs within the schooling context. So his theory develops this landscape of equity, which moves our view from the district level data, which is what a lot of ed finance scholarship relies on, to more school level data. And this is why applying this theoretical framework to school business administrators is really an excellent match, since school business administrators are in the school building every day, working with other administrators, teachers, and students. The theory argues that resources must be constructed by school personnel. So this is where it's really divergent from other ideas about resources, in that they bring the human element. It's really a bottom-up approach, looking at how the resources are actualized in the school building and experienced by the school community. There are 4 types: simple, compound, complex, and abstract, and I have examples there. So I used these 4 resource types when I analyzed my data. So my findings are centered around these 4 themes, and my school business administrators really had a lot to say about all 4. I'm going to highlight an example from each one for you today. We'll start with funds allocation, which is a simple resource. Again, simple resources are things that can kind of be bought and put in your budget line items. The pseudonyms will be used for my participants. So in this example, Nicole is describing her process on allocating the budget within the departments of the high school. She developed her own form so that really taking it into her own hands on how the allocations were dispersed. She says, one year, the social studies department might say, we need a whole new set of textbooks. And so they put in a request that might be $10,000. Or English might say, hey, we don't have anything new. We're only going to need maybe 1,000. So it might not seem that it's equal, but it's equitable because it's depending on what a department needs for that particular year. Our second example will come from a compound resource. And compound resources are what Grubb argues are 2 resources that are most effective and most equitable when put together. So our example from the findings is programs and implementations. And he argues that you need both together to work well, compounding, to be equitable. Our second SBA, Eric, discussed a food distribution program. And in this case, the idea behind the program was that students who did not qualify for free and reduced lunch, or maybe had not filled out the form, would not be food shamed when they're in the cafeteria and perhaps cannot pay for their school lunch. So they're able to run up a negative balance that would then later be absolved. He says, you want everybody to have access to food. We certainly have the resources. The negative is when food program named was rolled out, it was rolled out without a clear expectation of how there was going to be a protocol to follow up. So here we see how the school business administrators being in the school really have an impact on how programs with these big equity goals and ideas are rolled out and experienced by the school community. Next, I'm going to talk about an abstract resource. This is the socioeconomic capacity of a school community. Both SBAs talked at length about this idea, but I want to highlight when Eric discussed the parental contributions. He said, we're all held to the $60 per staff member staff appreciation limit, but like Ware, high school name, is inequitably favored just by virtue of the wealthy community, is like I can do stuff and tell the PTSA to directly pay for it. If, assuming they're willing to, and won't count against my books at all. So here we see the intersection of policy with the distribution of resources. There is a policy of the $60 per staff member, but then we have the school business administrator experiencing what Center for American Progress calls hidden money that is added to the resources of that school. And lastly, I want to highlight a complex resource, which is the self-efficacy of the SBAs. Self-efficacy is basically someone's belief in their capacity to influence change in their surroundings. Nicole discussed exam fees. She says, for example, we're an IB school and those exams are really expensive. We have a lot of students who just teeter on the poverty line, so they don't qualify for the waivers. I went to the county and said, listen, what can we do to make it more equitable so that our students aren't being turned away from the opportunity to take these final exams to participate in this vital program that will enhance their learning? So here we see an SBA kind of going above and beyond the role. This is certainly not in the description of what an SBA does, where she saw an inequitable practice and really wanted to increase the equity of the situation so that students could access these tests. I think this is a good example because we know from the literature that advanced placement and IB tests are disproportionately whiter and wealthier students. In this case, she's advocating within her majority minority school for more minoritized students to be able to access these tests, which then will have continual benefits in their academic success and mobility down the line. So what did these findings say? Really, what I took away is that the SBA's role includes complex decision-making and management choices. Their daily decisions really can influence the extent of equity experienced by the school community. And some SBAs are already applying this social justice mindset when navigating equity in school resource management. Again, this is a pilot study, so I'm very interested to see with a larger participant pool how these mindsets might vary or become more complicated. Our significance, I found that we really need this qualitative contribution to tell the stories and give voice to the experiences of the SBAs. These findings can help elevate and reframe the role of the SBA. I think this is particularly important in our current political moment, where a lot of school districts are looking to implement equitable and anti-racist practices. The SBA might be a role that would be overlooked, but I think with this study, it can show how important they really are to the allocation of resources. The findings can inform professional development for more SBAs that want to be more equitable in their management. And lastly, it can inform policy to actualize these equity goals, to put it from this local context to be applied in other contexts. Thank you so much, especially to my study participants, Drexel School of Education, Dr. Ayanna Allen Handy, my supervising professor, Bruce Levine, who's always been encouraging of my work and who I work with for my assistantship, Dr. Bernard Hall, in whose class I developed this pilot study last fall, and my fabulous cohort 6, with special shout out to Katrina and Chris, who read my very lengthy manuscript of this study. The loved reference slide, and I'm ready for questions and comments. Thank you again.
Thank you so much for your wonderful presentation, Kimberly. We really enjoyed it. So now we'll open it up to questions for about 10 minutes or so, and then we'll move on to our next presentation. So if you have a question, feel free to just unmute your mic and speak to the group, or you can enter it in the chat.
Hey, Kim, great job, really interesting. And one of the things I wonder about, and I happen to be familiar, I believe, with the actual school district you're writing about, and I had some of my own dealings there. I wonder how interesting it would be to look at who the people are who fill these roles, right? In other words, you mentioned that they're generally thought of for their technical expertise, and you can imagine that the hiring of people for these positions is based purely on whether they know their financial stuff, and not necessarily people who are that caring or concerned about the education world. Or it may be that these positions attract people who have a certain mindset and really care about the education system and also happen to be proficient. So It just, I wonder how much you've thought about that and who goes into that kind of role.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a good consideration. In my interviews, I did ask, how did you come to be it? And both the ones in this study, it was kind of a circuitous path. They didn't, from being a kid, want to be school business administrators, but were both involved either in finance or in schools in some way. And then for different reasons, found themselves in this role. So it was kind of like, oh, I found myself. It was a marriage of like, I wanted to help out kids. I have a finance background. This seems like a good fit. But I think your question is a good one in looking at what are the ideologies that these school business administrators bring to the job. And then how can we like promote that, or when you advertise the role, like who would be thinking about wanting to be in this position? And I think if we reframe it that way, it might draw from a different subset of potential employees that fit it. But yes, thank you.
There's a comment in the chat from Katrina. It says, nice work, Kim. It is exciting to see this progress through this stream of research and give voices to SBAs, especially as a past SBA myself. Any other comments or questions from the audience?
Hi,
Hey,
Kim.
Kim, great job. I just want to build on what Bruce just asked. Ideally, as this study progresses, what will your sample look like, and what will you strive to represent in terms of who you interview and the perspectives that you're bringing to the study as it gets fleshed out?
Yeah, thank you so much for the question. So this district is very large, and so I really want to saturate the district and get as many, if not all, of the school business administrators there, which can be up to, I think, 26. I've looked at like the spectrum of wealth, and what I was thinking is to kind of do a strata. I put them in 3 different categories of where they kind of fall of the school communities, and to look at how SBAs in the school communities that have different levels of wealth, what their experiences are. So I'm staying within the same district because I want to look at SBAs that are using the same policies and are guided by the similar constraints, so that it kind of, they have similar types of experiences in that way, but then look at it throughout the spectrum of wealth. So that's kind of my vision beyond this pilot study.
Hi, Kim. Excellent presentation. I just wanted to know if the school district or districts that you were studying had any kind of anti-racist or anti-discrimination policy. If so, was the finance department included in that?
Yeah, that's a good question. I know from in their pedagogy part of it, they're developing and trying to implement that. But I would have to look into it more to see if the school business administrators are included. And that's certainly something that from the findings of the study could be connected. But I would assume or think that it might be a missing link at the moment.
All right, you have some other comments in the chat. Dr. Flowers, well done, Kim, go cohort 6. And then from Nisha, very interesting study. And then from Tajma, great presentation. Kimberly, you provided important information on the roles of SBAs and why they are critical in ensuring that districts are engaging in equitable practices. We have one more comment here from Nisha. What role, if any, did you see gender playing in the level of efficacy of SBA?
Yeah, that's a good question. I did have 2 different genders represented in this pilot study. I didn't look at that specifically, so I'm not sure that I could speak to it at this moment, but I think the different aspects of the people's identity and how those intersect are definitely something worth further exploration, to see how their identities influence their mindsets and then their decision making in their roles. Thank you for the question.
Great questions. Sinead said, wonderful presentation, Kim. I enjoyed learning more about the role of SBAs and felt like your pilot showed how they play an important role in ensuring equity. So wonderful. All right. Any other questions and comments before we move on? Wonderful. If everybody could give Kim a round of applause again for her wonderful presentation. Thank you so much for being here with us today, Kim.
Thank
Really
you.
appreciate it. Wonderful. All right, so we're going to move on to our next presenter. So our second speaker is Maria Toglia, who is an EDD student in the School of Education. Maria earned her bachelor's degree with a major in psychology at the University of Denver and her master's in child psychology at Vanderbilt University. She began her career as an outpatient child and adolescent therapist in community mental health. Since becoming certified as a school psychologist from Immaculata University, Maria has served in the Pennsylvania public school system for the last 15 years, working with students who present with a broad range of learning and social emotional needs. She has developed a particular interest in literacy and has worked as an advocate for best practice reading instructions as a board member of the Pennsylvania branch of the International Dyslexia Association. Maria is also involved with the Read by Fourth campaign in Philadelphia, and she co-chairs the Teacher Preparation and Support Working Group, focusing on advancing teacher training that is aligned with the science of reading. Maria is a doctoral candidate in the EDD program at Drexel with a concentration in public policy. Today, she will be presenting her dissertation research that focuses on examining teacher preparation in structured literacy. The title of Maria's presentation is Examining the Impact of One Professional Development Program in Structured Literacy on Teacher Knowledge, a Quasi-experimental Study. So I'd like to hand it over to Maria now for her presentation. Please welcome Maria.
Thank you. Okay, thank you so much, Jemima, for your introduction and for the opportunity to present my dissertation research this afternoon. The title of my study is Examining the Impact of One Professional Development Program in Structured Literacy on Teacher Knowledge, a Quasi-experimental Study. Oops. So just some, there we go. The agenda for today, I'm going to begin with talking about some background for the research, then discuss the problem and the purpose, talk a little bit about the professional development program that I studied, present my research questions, discuss the conceptual framework, then present my methods and findings, and then end with implications, recommendations, and conclusions. So just as background, I'm a school psychologist and I work with lots of students, excuse me, who have difficulty learning to read. I'm also the mother of a young adult who has dyslexia. So I have seen from both a professional and a personal perspective what it is like when children have difficulty learning to read. And it not only impacts them in the classroom, it affects their social emotional well-being and their day-to-day functioning. So I came to the research with the belief that the ability to read really is an essential skill that all students need to be successful in school and meet the demands of the modern world. And I see reading as a social justice issue. And I really love this quote by the Director General of UNESCO, who says that literacy is the first step towards freedom, towards liberation from social and economic constraints. It is the prerequisite for development, both individual and collective. It reduces poverty and inequality, creates wealth, and helps to eradicate problems of nutrition and public health. So reading is essential to literacy. And it turns out that reading is actually very complex. But this graphic here, the ladder of reading developed by Nancy Young, is just illustrating what it is that kids need to learn how to read based on the research. And if you look at the top of the ladder, you can see that a very small number, 5% of kids, learn how to read, and it seems effortless for them. Their brains make the necessary connections, and they're off and running. Another 35% can benefit from just general instructional practices in the classroom and learn how to read. But we know that between 40 and 50% of kids require what we call code-based or phonics-based explicit systematic and sequential instruction, also known as structured literacy, in order to read. And for the 10 to 15% of students with dyslexia, not only do they require these structural literacy methods, they require diagnostic teaching with many repetitions in order to learn how to read. So while structured literacy benefits all students learning to read, the majority of students actually need it in order to become proficient. So structured literacy was actually codified, that term was codified by the International Dyslexia Association recently in 2018, but it reflects decades of research, including the findings from the National Reading Panel and subsequent research that shows that structured literacy methods benefit children in the general education curriculum and children at risk for reading failure. Now, being a great reader as a teacher is not enough to be able to teach children learning to read, because structured literacy methods draw on expert knowledge about English language structures. So phonological and phonemic awareness, the alphabetical principle, phonics instruction, and morphology. And it's quite complex information that teachers need to learn. Now, there have been published research-based guidelines for teacher preparation, including the knowledge and practice standards developed by the International Dyslexia Association. And when programs follow these guidelines, they can be accredited by IDA. Now, despite these guidelines, many pre-service teacher candidates are not exposed to the scientific knowledge related to reading instruction. And as a result, many teachers lack this content knowledge that's important for effectively teaching kids to read using these structured literacy methods. So the problem is, despite a well-established research base indicating that all children learning to read benefit from explicit systematic instruction, teachers frequently do not receive the training that they need to master the knowledge and skills necessary to effectively implement structured literacy in the classroom. And the significance of the problem is well reflected in this graphic here that shows the results from the National Assessment of Educational Progress in 2019 for fourth grade students in our country. And you can see that the majority of students fall in the below basic range, 34%. So these kids are far below grade level and cannot access the general education curriculum and are going to need intensive interventions to catch up, some of whom will get them and many of whom will not. The next largest group is in the basic range with 31%, and these kids are also going to struggle because the general education curriculum is geared toward kids who are reading on grade level. And there are about 26% who are on grade level and 9% who are advanced. Now, we focus on fourth grade reading scores because there's a lot of research that shows that students who do not read on grade level by the fourth grade are at risk for dropping out of school, becoming involved in the criminal justice system, being relegated to low-wage jobs that earning less than $100 a week, and experience poorer health outcomes than students who are reading on grade level. And when you disaggregate the data by race and ethnicity, you can see that Black children, Native children, and Hispanic children in our country are disproportionately represented in the basic and below basic range. So it really is a racial justice issue as well, this reading crisis in our country. So there's been a lot of research done on professional development in reading, but there's been very little research that has looked specifically at those published guidelines I mentioned, like the knowledge and practice standards. So the purpose of my study was to examine the impact of one online IDA accredited structured literacy professional development program in the Northeast on teachers' knowledge of English language structures. So a little bit about the program that I studied. It is aligned with IDA's knowledge and practice standards and was accredited by them. It's delivered on an online teaching platform and takes approximately 30 hours to complete. All participants take a pre and post-test assessment using the Reading Assessment Survey, the RAS, to measure teacher knowledge. It's a self-directed program and can be completed in varying timeframes. and it actively engages teachers in a series of 17 content-focused learn, practice, and apply cycles. And there's opportunity for participation in virtual communities of practice throughout the program. So the first thing I was interested in is whether there would be a significant increase in teacher knowledge following participation in the program. So the first question was, is there a statistically significant increase in teachers' composite scores on that reading assessment survey following participation in the IDA accredited structured literacy program? The second question was looking at the temporal focus. So is there a statistically significant difference in RAS composite gain scores? So that's the difference between the pre-test and the post-test composite score among teachers who participated in the program, depending on the rate of program completion. So whether they were fast, moderate, or slow. And the last question was looking at whether or not there was a statistically significant relationship between the RAS composite gain scores and frequency of participation in that virtual community of practice among teachers who participated. Now, the conceptual framework for my study was guided by 3 large and related streams of literature. The first was around reading development and the English language. And here I talk about the neurobiology of reading, the models of reading development, typical and atypical development, and implications for instruction. Now, this body of research then informs the knowledge that teachers draw on when implementing classroom practices, teaching kids to read. So here I talk about those published guidelines. So beginning with general guidelines oriented toward general education teachers who are working with neurodiverse students in the classroom, and then narrow down to guidelines that are targeted toward a broad array of literacy professionals, and then narrowing down even further to talking about the knowledge and practice standards for teachers of reading that are specific to structured literacy. Now, this body of research then informs the professional development for teachers of reading. In here, I talk about the needs of adult learners, the components of effective professional development, and then narrow down again to professional development for teachers of reading. So my methodology was a quasi-experimental one-group pre-test, post-test design, which is frequently used in social science research. And this allowed me to examine whether the target professional development program significantly impacted teacher knowledge of English language structures. So I was able to collect de-identified quantitative pre-test and post-test data using that RAS, as well as demographic data for 61 teachers, the majority of whom were female, Caucasian, and early elementary educators. The limitations of my study included a lack of randomization since teachers had already begun the program by the time my study started, and the small sample size. So I did statistical analyses to answer my research questions using SPSS. So for the first question, looking at whether there was a significant difference between those composite pre and post-test scores, I conducted a dependent sample one-tailed test, t-test. And what I found was that participants' RAS composite post scores were indeed significantly higher than their RAS composite pretest scores at the 0.001 level. Now, the mean pretest score was 65% and increased to 81% on post-test. And there was a large effect size with about 78% of the variance in RAS post-test scores attributed to participating in that structured literacy program. For the second question, looking at that temporal feature, whether there were differences in RAS gain scores, depending on how quickly teachers completed the program, I conducted a one-way ANOVA. And RAS gain scores did not significantly differ depending on rate of completion. And there was a very low effect size with only 2.3% of the variance in RAS composite gain scores attributed to rate of program completion. For the last question, looking to see whether there was a significant relationship between how often teachers participated in that virtual community of practice and their gain scores, I conducted a Pearson product correlation. And there was not a significant relationship between frequency of participation and their gain scores at the 0.05 level. And again, there was a very low effect size here. So the interpretations to these findings, I found that the online professional development program was highly efficacious in improving teacher knowledge of English language structures. And this is the knowledge they need in order to effectively teach kids to read using structured literacy in the classroom. And based on the literature review I did, I think that the efficacy of the program is related to several features. First, it was the active nature of the program. So teachers weren't just listening to lectures or reading articles. They were actively engaging in learning objects that were being presented in multiple formats. It was very content focused, specific to the knowledge and practice standards. And it was also highly relevant to what they were doing day to day in their jobs, teaching children to read. There were opportunities for collaborative learning. So not only in those virtual communities of practice, but also as they were learning in cohorts with each other in the same schools, teachers could support one another and learn from one another. The program was also of sufficient duration. So we know that professional development between 20 hours and 100 hours is most effective in helping to increase teacher knowledge. And so this allows for the program to be comprehensive enough and also to allow teachers the opportunity for the reflection and feedback that they need in order to develop their skills. And also it was an autonomous program and self-directed, which meets the needs of adult learners. Also important was having that flexibility to be able to decide how quickly you wanted to complete the program. It didn't affect the efficacy of the learning. And again, it meets the needs of adult learners. And finally, that last finding where there was no relationship between the frequency of participation in the virtual community of practice and gain scores on the RAS, that was the most surprising finding because I expected from the literature that there might be a positive correlation there. But when I looked at the distribution of frequency of participation, it was actually skewed to the high end. It wasn't a normal distribution. So most of the teachers actually participated very frequently. So in any one of those sessions, there was a nice mixture of high, medium, and low knowledge. So teachers had the opportunity to really learn from one another, and they were able to do that active engagement and reflective learning that is important for promoting the development of individual competencies when you're learning new complex information. So the implications of my study, I believe that the online format of this professional development program has the potential to expand access to high quality professional development in structured literacy, and that it can be used in lieu of these traditional one-day workshops that are typically given in districts that are less effective in increasing teacher knowledge. It can also be used in areas that lack that ready access to in-person training, like in rural districts, for example. Also, the online access, I believe, has become particularly relevant during the COVID-19 pandemic, where many adults are now turning to online learning to meet their professional development needs. Also, the autonomy to choose when and where to learn, I believe expands adults' potential for maintaining that active engagement that's necessary to acquire complex knowledge and skills around structured literacy. And finally, it's really important, the increasing teacher knowledge is the first step in changing instructional practices that can improve student outcomes. So the most salient recommendations for research going forward, I believe, are first, taking a look at whether adding a coaching or a mentoring aspect to the professional development program would actually further strengthen teacher mastery of these English language constructs. Because if you recall, the average on post-test was 81%. And while that was a significant increase, there leaves a lot of room for further learning. I also believe that it's important to apply what we know from implementation science to examine how we can support teachers' ability to apply what they learn in professional development to sustaining implementation of these instructional practices that we know can improve student outcomes, which would include tracking outcomes as they relate to teacher training and teacher knowledge. And finally, I think it would be important to use qualitative inquiry methods to develop a deep understanding of how teachers perceive their professional development experiences so that we can create the types of systemic changes and supports that would be necessary to bring structured literacy methods to scale in this country. And finally, I believe that the ongoing literacy crisis in this country demands a robust response from both researchers and educators, so that all children get the instruction they need to develop proficient reading skills. And I think that the multifaceted methods used in the program that I studied shows great promise in providing teachers with the knowledge they need to effectively teach all children learning to read using scientifically based structured literacy practices. And here are my references.
Well, thank you so much, Maria. If everyone could give her a round of applause, virtual clap. Thank you so much for that informative presentation. So we're going to open it up to questions now for Maria. So you guys can enter your questions in the chat, or you can unmute and ask your question. Dr. Geller mentioned in the chat, excellent presentation, Maria. Thank you, Dr. Geller. Any other questions or comments for Maria? Nisha said, a very interesting presentation, Maria. I like the recommendation for a deeper dive using qualitative methodology. And Sinead said, good job. Great job, Maria, from Sherry.
Yeah, I had hoped actually originally to use qualitative methods in addition to quantitative methods, but the pandemic got in the way. And so my initial study changed. And so I ended up just using the quantitative methods, but I do agree that getting that fuller picture of professional development would be important going forward.
All right, wonderful. More comments in the chat. Bruce Levine, thanks for interesting presentation. Great job from Deanna. All right, great. Well, I just want to thank our presenters today, Kim and Maria, for being here and presenting such wonderful research. I want to thank all of you for attending and ask if you can mark your calendars for our next colloquium event, which will be on Friday, February 5th from noon to 1 online. And so we look forward to seeing you all online. And thank you so much again for joining us. Have a great weekend and happy MLK Day.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everyone. Great job.